Are you ready to learn the truth about how the world's greatest treasure destroyed those who found it? For centuries, people have dreamed of the fabulous riches of uncharted lands, imagining mountains of gold and fields of precious stones.
However, reality turned out to be far darker and more instructive than any legend of cursed treasures.
This story will forever change your understanding of human greed and reveal the true cost of blind military ambition. We often think that wealth brings power, but at the decisive moment, it can become its owner's most terrifying enemy. Precious metals have always been considered a symbol of absolute power and a sign of divine favor. But in this particular campaign, they unexpectedly turned into an unmovable anchor, dragging the soldiers to the bottom of history.
The gold that was supposed to ensure a comfortable life became a heavy burden, hindering their ability to move and fight.
Warriors accustomed to strict discipline began to lose their heads at the sight of untold treasures, forgetting their orders and their own safety. Watch the video to the end, and you'll learn how the invisible force of greed broke the conquerors' iron discipline and led them to a catastrophic collapse on the narrow embankments of the ancient capital. We'll break down, step by step, exactly how the thirst for profit robbed people of their senses and forced them to make fatal tactical mistakes. This is a story about how the glitter of gold can overshadow even the instinct for self-preservation at the most dangerous moment of one's life. What if I told you that everything you believed in is a lie? It is commonly believed that an organized army is defeated only by the superior forces of a well-trained enemy. The expedition entered the vast island city with a clear plan for domination and undeniable technological superiority. Steel armor and strict subordination made these men virtually invulnerable in any standard engagement. However, the true destructive power lay hidden in the palace's basements, filled to the brim with local riches. Heavy ingots of yellow metal began to corrode the army's structure long before the first urban uprising began.
Commanders initially attempted to centralize the collection of all found valuables for subsequent organized distribution.
They created special secure rooms where each item was carefully cataloged and weighed. This bureaucracy gave the illusion of complete control over the situation and maintained the appearance of order. But news of the colossal amounts of loot quickly spread among the expedition's rank and file. The soldiers began to realize that their official share might turn out to be significantly less than what they could carry off themselves. Local leaders watched this transformation of the uninvited guests closely. They saw how the fearsome warriors bent under the weight of their overflowing backpacks. The capital's outward calm served as an excellent cover for preparing a large-scale response to the presence of the outsiders. Bridges across the canals were gradually dismantled, and supply routes were methodically cut off. The invaders found themselves in a comfortable trap, surrounded by water and their own wealth. When food supplies began to dwindle rapidly, the value of the yellow metal plummeted. Nevertheless, no one was in a hurry to get rid of the accumulated cargo, hoping for a quick resolution to their problems. The command attempted to organize foraging raids, but the heavily laden units returned empty-handed.
They were unable to pursue the enemy's mobile groups or retreat quickly when faced with the threat of encirclement.
The logistical crisis grew by the hour, paralyzing any active operations by the garrison. Stress and constant tension fueled paranoia among the expedition's rank and file. Soldiers slept in full gear, refusing to part with their heavy packs even at night. This led to chronic fatigue and a complete loss of concentration at their posts. Perimeter security became nominal, as the men were physically unable to perform their duties in such a state. The gold had robbed them of sleep, rest, and the ability to adequately assess their surroundings. The realization of the impending collapse forced the leadership to decide on an immediate evacuation. They faced a difficult choice between saving lives and transporting the captured treasures. This dilemma tested their ability to think rationally under extreme stress. I'd love to hear your perspective. What do you think about how material possessions can override the instinct for self-preservation? Share your thoughts in the comments. Be sure to subscribe to our channel. Guess what happened next? The order to retreat caused a real panic among the soldiers, who didn't want to lose their savings. The command officially allowed them to take as many valuables as each person could carry. This was a fatal mistake that completely destroyed any chance of a quick and stealthy withdrawal. People began frantically repacking their belongings, trying to fit in as many heavy bars as possible. Common sense gave way to blind hope of breaking through the encirclement while fully loaded. Preparing for the exit took too long, allowing the city's defenders to finish their preparations. The warriors' backpacks swelled to incredible sizes, shifting their centers of gravity and disrupting their coordination. Many abandoned spare weapons and protective armor components in favor of extra kilograms of loot. They naively believed they could cover several kilometers along narrow trails under the cover of night. This overestimation of their own strength was a direct consequence of their months-long blindness. The column began its slow march toward one of the main dams leading to the mainland.
The darkness hid them from visual observation, but the clang of metal echoed through every block.
Every step was taken with great difficulty, and the overburdened people quickly lost their breath. The expedition's vanguard carried portable wooden planks to cross the destroyed sections of the bridges. This task required colossal physical effort, even without taking into account the participants' personal luggage. The dam was an artificial embankment just a few paces wide, laid across the bottom of the lake. On either side of it lay dark water, concealing the local population's fleet. They had to march in tight formation, which ruled out any evasive maneuvers or repositioning. The people in the center of the column were completely hemmed in by their comrades and could not see the road ahead. This created the effect of a blind mass slowly creeping toward the unknown. When the vanguard reached the first destroyed bridge, the entire army came to a halt.
Engineers began laying wooden planks, trying to work as quickly and quietly as possible.
At that moment, the rear ranks, unaware of the obstacle, continued to press forward. A severe crush ensued in which the overburdened soldiers began to lose their balance. The narrow strip of land could not accommodate such a concentration of bodies weighed down by metal. The water began to swallow the first victims of this chaos, leaving them no chance of survival. The heavy ingots, so carefully guarded for months, now acted as deadly weights. They dragged their owners to the muddy bottom of the lake with relentless speed. In the next chapter, you will learn how this heavy cargo turned a strategic retreat into a massive tragedy. Why did the instinct for survival fail to overcome the desire to preserve material possessions? Are you ready for the shocking truth? The real cause of death for most of the expedition members was not enemy action, but their own bags. When the wooden planks on the first span finally broke under the crowd's excessive weight, the path forward was cut off. Hundreds of people found themselves on the edge of the abyss, with the rest of the column pressing down on them from behind.
In this critical situation, jettisoning the cargo was the only logical solution for survival.
However, the paradox of the human psyche was that many chose to hold on to their loot until the very end. Attacks from the water did not cease for a single moment, intensifying the general chaos and panic. The enemy's boats maneuvered easily along the embankment, delivering precise and effective strikes. The city's defenders methodically cleared their territory of strangers, paralyzed by fear and their burdens. The lack of any coordination on the part of the officers rendered the resistance utterly pointless. The expedition methodically destroyed itself, refusing to acknowledge its fundamental mistake. Soon the gap where the bridge had been began to fill with abandoned belongings, carts, and those who couldn't make it out. This makeshift bridge of material possessions became the only way to continue moving forward.
Subsequent units were forced to walk directly across this eerie structure to reach the other side.
Every step on such a surface was extremely unstable and dangerous. The slippery metal of the armor and the smooth surfaces of the chests offered no reliable footing. Many stumbled on this makeshift crossing, adding to the bridge's foundation. Those who managed to cross were completely exhausted, both physically and mentally. They continued to carry their dwindling supplies, despite the horror they had just endured. This episode demonstrated just how fragile military discipline can be in the face of unforeseen obstacles. The Army's internal weakness proved far more destructive than any of the enemy's external fortifications. History will forever remember this night as an example of how greed leads to utter collapse. Please like this video if you appreciate a deep and objective analysis of historical events. Your feedback helps us create higher quality and more detailed content. What if everything you were taught is now obsolete? We're used to thinking that professionals can always take control of a situation, but that night, control vanished entirely. By the time the convoy reached the second section of the collapsed dam, they had run out of portable decking. It had been left far behind, lost in the chaos of the first breach. Crossing the wide water barrier without additional equipment was an impossible task for the overburdened men. The army came to a complete halt, stuck in the middle of a vast body of water. The pressure from behind continued to mount as the rear guard desperately tried to break out of the city blocks. The men on the front line found themselves caught between deep water and the surging crowd of their own comrades. At this point, the most massive displacement of soldiers beyond the narrow embankment began. Those standing at the edges inevitably lost their balance and fell into the lake. The water swallowed them by the dozen, leaving no trace on the churning surface. By midnight, the column had stretched for several kilometers, broken into numerous fragments. Each fragment was an isolated group trying to find its way in the darkness. Communication between the vanguard and the rear guard was completely lost, depriving the expedition of unified leadership. Those who managed to overcome the water barriers did not stop to help those who had fallen behind. Individualism had finally supplanted collective responsibility, destroying the army from within. Many chose to surrender to their circumstances, realizing the utter hopelessness of their situation. They simply sat down on the stones of the dam, refusing to continue this exhausting march. Exhaustion, both physical and psychological, had reached its limit. The loss of their wealth and comrades had robbed them of the motivation to fight for their own lives. These people became easy prey for their pursuers, offering them no resistance whatsoever. The titanic tension of that night forever altered the psyche of those destined to survive. They witnessed firsthand how grand ambitions shattered against harsh reality and the laws of physics. Gold, the goal of the entire campaign, turned out to be the most effective weapon in the hands of the local population. In the next chapter, you will learn how a lack of coordination led to the most massive collapse in the history of this campaign. Could they have maintained the army structure if they had shed excess weight in a planned and organized manner beforehand? As the night deepened, the situation on the earthen pass reached its peak of disorganization. Visibility dropped to zero, and the only landmarks were the splashes of water and the shouts of those ahead. The narrow embankments no longer resembled paths to salvation, having turned into narrow corridors with no way out. Commanders who managed to maintain even minimal control over their men formed small assault groups. They tried to push through the piles of abandoned equipment using brute physical force. These groups acted ruthlessly, pushing soldiers who got in their way aside or straight into the water. Internal competition for a spot on the road became no less fierce than the fight against the enemy. The expedition was devouring itself in a desperate attempt to break out of the encirclement. The vast amount of valuables thrown into the lake altered the bottom's topography around the fords. In some shallow spots, entire shoals formed from chests and scattered jewelry. These improvised islands of wealth paradoxically saved several lives. Exhausted people could temporarily lean on them to catch their breath before making a dash for the shore. The gold that had doomed hundreds ultimately served as an accidental lifeline for a few. Meanwhile, the capital's defenders methodically completed their work of clearing the area. They did not seek large-scale direct confrontations, allowing the enemy to destroy itself. Their tactics boiled down to constant psychological pressure and maintaining a high level of panic. Boats circled around the dams, creating a sense of complete control over the situation. The invaders realized they were in a foreign world whose rules were beyond their control. By the time the sky began to lighten, the bulk of the survivors had reached solid ground on the mainland. They collapsed to the ground, exhausted, unable to believe they had been saved. Their appearance was a stark contrast to that of the gleaming army that had entered the city several months earlier. Exhausted, stripped of their equipment, and utterly hollow inside, they were a pitiful sight. The night of sorrow had ended, leaving behind only the bitter taste of a crushing defeat. The secret that will change the military industry lies in analyzing the mistakes of that terrible night. The morning light mercilessly laid bare the true scale of the catastrophe that had unfolded on the dams. The lake was littered with abandoned belongings, debris, and the remnants of the great expedition's pride. The survivors sat on the shore in a state of utter numbness, staring at the dark waters that had swallowed their comrades. The illusion of their own invincibility dissolved along with the first rays of the sun. The initial tally of losses plunged the command into a state of deep shock. A significant portion of the personnel had simply vanished, never reaching the mainland stronghold. Along with the men, the overwhelming majority of the Army's strategic resources remained at the bottom of the lake. The gunpowder had become damp, the artillery had been abandoned, and provisions were lost in the chaos of the retreat. The expedition had lost its technological advantage, leaving it vulnerable to any subsequent attacks. The enemy had no intention of giving them time for a prolonged rest or to regroup their forces. Reconnaissance units made up of local residents were already observing the survivors' camp from a safe distance. The danger of a new attack was all too real, and staying put was out of the question. The command had to make tough decisions, forcing the exhausted people back into formation. Discipline was restored through harsh measures, as there was simply no time left for persuasion. It was necessary to urgently determine a new route toward Allied territories. The path lay through hostile lands where every settlement posed a potential threat. The Army, deprived of supply trains and heavy weaponry, had to rely solely on speed. The mobility lost due to greed now became their only chance for salvation. The logistics of the retreat were based on the most extreme conservation of strength and resources. This period became a time of harsh reevaluation of all values and priorities. The soldiers learned to rely on one another anew, realizing that individualism leads to ruin. Shared adversity united the remnants of the Army more strongly than promises of wealth and glory. In the next chapter, you will learn how the Army managed to adapt to the new conditions and restore its combat effectiveness. Do you think it is possible to fully restore trust within the ranks after such a massive failure? The retreat demanded a radical shift in the expedition's entire tactical paradigm. The command realized that the previous methods of warfare were completely ineffective under the current circumstances. The Army could no longer dictate the rules of the game. It had to adapt to its environment. The top priority became moving covertly and avoiding any major open engagements. Bulky formations gave way to mobile columns capable of maneuvering quickly on narrow trails. The attitude toward wounded and exhausted comrades also underwent significant changes. Whereas during the retreat from the city everyone had looked out for themselves, mutual aid was now a strict rule. The column moved at the pace of its slowest member, leaving no one behind. Special stretchers were set up for those who could not move on their own. This care for one's fellow soldiers helped restore morale and trust within the fragmented units. Discipline was enforced with an iron fist, quelling any signs of panic or insubordination. Commanders were at the front of the line, sharing all the hardships of the march on equal footing with the ordinary rank and file. Leading by example became the best tool for motivating the weary and disheartened. Orders were carried out swiftly and without question, as the cost of a mistake was too high. The Army gradually transformed into a single, well-coordinated machine focused on a single specific task. Constant movement prevented the enemy from organizing a full-scale siege of the column. Minor skirmishes occurred regularly, but the expedition had learned to quickly break contact and retreat. They used the terrain to cover their retreat and set up local ambushes. The enemy constantly lost their trail, unable to grasp the logic behind the movements of these ragged but stubborn men. The tactic of avoiding battle paid off, allowing them to preserve what remained of their ranks. Several weeks of continuous marching had transformed the soldiers beyond recognition. They had lost the polish and confidence of conquerors, but gained the resourcefulness of seasoned survivors. Their gazes had grown harsher, and their movements more calculated and economical. Illusions had been dispelled, leaving room only for harsh pragmatism and an understanding of the value of life. This difficult phase laid the foundation for the future revival of their military might. Reaching territory loyal to the expedition marked a turning point in the entire retreat. Local tribes who had been at odds with the capital welcomed the exhausted army and granted it refuge. This was a critically important stage for the physical and psychological recovery of the troops. Safe camps allowed the men to finally take off their armor and get a good night's sleep for the first time in a long while. the constant sense of anxiety began to slowly recede, giving way to constructive planning. Having a reliable rear base solved the acute shortage of food and clean water. Local residents generously shared their supplies, understanding the strategic importance of these strangers' survival. Regular meals helped the soldiers quickly regain their strength and return to their former physical condition. Medical care, however primitive, saved the lives of many who had been wounded during the nighttime breakout. The army gradually came back to life, shaking off the numbness of the recent catastrophe. The soldiers' morale was restored as the new plan took shape. The sense of hopelessness gave way to a cold determination to reclaim their lost positions. Revenge for their fallen comrades became a powerful motivating factor, uniting people better than any orders. Gold was no longer mentioned in conversation. Now the goal was the complete destruction of the enemy structure. The army was ready to return, but in a completely different capacity. Reconnaissance operations resumed with renewed vigor, gathering information on the state of the capital. It became known that the city had been severely damaged by internal conflicts and a shortage of resources. An invisible threat in the form of a new fever had also weakened the defenders' ranks, reducing their combat effectiveness. The expedition carefully chose the moment to launch a counterattack, taking its time. Time was now on their side, allowing the Allies to gather their strength. This respite proved the flexibility and adaptability of military strategy. The leadership managed to turn a catastrophic defeat into a starting point for a new large-scale campaign. They had learned the harsh lesson taught to them at the dams and changed their methods forever. The next phase of the operation was to be the complete opposite of their first visit to the city. The army was preparing for the final chapter of this long and bloody saga. The return to the lake began with a methodical and systematic capture of all adjacent territories. The revitalized army, supported by thousands of allies, acted with calculation and without undue haste. Every coastal settlement was occupied and fortified, creating a tight ring of isolation around the capital. The command no longer relied on luck, building a reliable logistical network in its rear. Any attempts by the defenders to break through this blockade were harshly and swiftly suppressed. Every attempt to break out of the capital ran into a solid wall of steel and discipline. The attackers had built a multi-tiered defense system on the approaches to their positions. They used the terrain and artificial barriers to neutralize any attacks. The besieged spent their last reserves of strength on futile sorties that ended only in further losses. The strategy of total control over the territory proved entirely effective under these conditions. Discipline within the expedition's ranks was maintained at the highest level, leaving no room for error. The soldiers understood the importance of every action they took, and they strictly followed the approved plan. The perimeter was patrolled around the clock, eliminating any possibility of unnoticed infiltration or escape. There was no longer any talk of loot or trophies. Everyone was focused on completing the mission. Professionalism had finally driven greed from the minds of these hardened warriors. The besieged tried to use their old tactics, but they no longer worked. Ambushes were easily uncovered, and surprise attacks were shattered against the attackers' tight formation. Illusions crumbled on both sides of the barricades. The expedition shed its arrogance, and the defenders, their hope. The ring around the central districts tightened ever more, heralding the inevitable end. The city, once a symbol of impregnability, was living out its final weeks. The final stage of the siege was marked by the systematic destruction of all remaining fortifications within the city walls. The expedition and its allies slowly advanced from block to block, leaving no stone unturned. The capital's defenses fragmented, turning into separate, unconnected pockets of resistance. The defenders fought for every street, but their strength was finally sapped by hunger and deprivation. Organized command vanished, giving way to the desperate actions of isolated groups. The central squares, once striking in their splendor, had turned into a zone of continuous ruins. The troops methodically cleared the territory, advancing toward the heart of the city with icy calm. There was no triumph or joy in this advance, only the heavy, methodical work of professionals. They were no longer searching for stashes of gold. Their sole interest was the complete suppression of the enemy's will. The city's wealth had lost all appeal in light of the efforts required to capture it. The final collapse of the defense system occurred when the last lines of defense in the government quarter fell. The resistance ceased not because of surrender, but due to the complete physical exhaustion of the defenders. The vast metropolis, which had seemed an impregnable fortress, sank into a heavy silence, broken only by the sound of falling debris. The scale of the destruction was staggering. The complex infrastructure of dams and canals had been virtually destroyed. Nature and war had wiped the results of centuries of labor from the face of the earth. The victors stood amid these ruins, feeling none of the expected sense of grand triumph. The long-term consequences of this campaign proved far more complex than a mere change of power in the region. The economy and logistics of the once prosperous empire were paralyzed for decades to come. The remaining population was in a state of deep shock, deprived of its familiar governing structure. The victors were left to manage the ashes, the restoration of which required colossal resources. The gold, which had caused the deaths of thousands of people on that terrible night, remained lying at the bottom. Attempts were made to retrieve it, but a thick layer of silt had securely concealed most of the treasures. This metal became a peculiar monument to human greed and the strategic short-sightedness of the first expedition. The lake kept its secrets, serving as a reminder of how easily material possessions can destroy grand plans. History turned the tables, cruelly punishing those who placed wealth above discipline. This conflict forever changed the methods of warfare in new territories for all subsequent armies. Illusions of easy conquest gave way to an understanding of the need for thorough preparation and adaptation to conditions. The experience of the night retreat and the long siege entered tactical textbooks as an example of catastrophe and subsequent rebirth. Commanders learned to value logistics and diplomacy above mere technological superiority. The era of blind ambition ended, giving way to an era of harsh pragmatism. The new regime established itself on the ruins, but its legitimacy remained in doubt for a long time. Internal strife among allies and victors began almost immediately after the fall of the capital. The common goal vanished, and old disagreements and political ambitions resurfaced. The cycle of conflict began anew, proving that there is no such thing as a final victory. The city fell, but the consequences of its fall reverberated for a very long time. We have journeyed from being blinded by wealth to the cold realization of the cost of strategic errors. This chronicle shows how the fine line between triumph and catastrophe can hinge on the weight of a single backpack. The army vanished into the waters of the lake not because of weakness, but because it had forgotten its primary purpose. We have examined in detail every stage of this tragic and instructive military campaign, from the first signs of a breakdown in discipline to the catastrophic nighttime retreat and the final, exhausting siege. The story of the army's downfall on the narrow dams is not merely a tale of defeat, it is a classic example of how internal flaws destroy a system faster than external threats. Greed paralyzed logistics, and gold literally dragged the expedition's best specialists to the bottom. Only a radical change in strategy in a harsh school of survival allowed the remnants of the force to regain control of the situation. This historical episode clearly demonstrates that, under extreme conditions, the weight of material possessions always pales in comparison to the weight of organization and reason. The true strength of an army lies not in its weapons or the amount of treasure it has accumulated, but in its ability to adapt and maintain its structure under pressure. What other historical events do you think hold similar lessons about human psychology in times of crisis? Suggest topics for future videos you'd like to see in the comments, and be sure to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on new in-depth analyses.